From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome to this special edition of Potomac Watch with Phil Gramm, the economist and former senator from Texas, who has a new book with some startling findings about inequality that ought to be part of our political debate but are not. I should add that former Senator Gramm is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and we're glad he is. And I think his first op-ed was back in the 1970s when you were at Texas A&M teaching economics, Phil.
Changed my life. I had written all these academic articles, which nobody had read, but they'd gotten me promoted. And then all of a sudden, I wrote an article on whale oil and the energy crisis. And I got something like 1,200 first-class letters, and it just changed my life. I realized that I was wasting my time. And so I ended up quitting my job, running for public office. My mama cried the day I told her, but it all worked out.
Sure did. In 1978, you were elected to Congress as a Democrat, but then resigned your seat to run as a Republican in the same district in a special election. You won that in the 1984 ran and won for the Senate. And over those years in Congress, you were influential in passing a great deal of the very significant economic legislation, including the Reagan tax and spending package, Gramm-Rudman bill on spending. And now, in what I guess, well, certainly in your political retirement, not your intellectual retirement, you've written a book, and it's called The Myth of American Inequality, How Government Biases Policy Debate, and your co-authors are Robert Eklund and John Early. And it's fascinating to me, Phil, because inequality, as you know, or the concern about it, dominates our political debates and has now for a decade or so, at least maybe longer. And you argue that inequality isn't all that it's cracked up to be, if I can put it that way. Why don't you explain that?
I think that's fair. Well, you know, it does dominate our political debate. The economist said it is universally accepted that income inequality is high in the West and rising rapidly. And what we show is that if you go back and look at the way the Census Bureau calculates household income, which is the building block of all American statistics, that going back to 1947, they made a decision not to count payments in kind, only cash payments. And over time, they collected data on all these things like food stamps, housing subsidies, Medicaid, Medicare, and 100 and odd other federal, state, and local programs, but they never included them in their income measure. And as a result, today, as a result of that initial decision and about a dozen others, they count only 1/3 of all the transfer payments made by the government as income to the recipients, and they don't take taxes into account. How I've discovered this, and I don't know this is a unique discovery, but is when the census puts out its household income figure, and then the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out its consumption figure, the bottom 20% of Americans consume twice as much as their income.
So they're getting that money from somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And the second quintile consumes 11% more than its income. And the top quintile, top 20% of earners, consume only 50% of their income, even though there's no data to show that they're saving anything like that. So in today's Wall Street Journal, I point out that since the census doesn't count refundable tax credits as income, none of these expenditures, or very few of them, during the pandemic count as income to poverty recipients. So the bottom line is, when you count all transfers as income to the recipients of the transfers, when you take taxes as income lost to the taxpayer, the difference between the top and bottom 20% of the income distribution is not 16.7, which the census says, but it's 4.0.
That's 16.7 times.
That's right.
In terms of income.
And 4 times.
4 is the real number.
Is the real number. And look, in a free society, you can debate how much income redistribution you want. But it's a big difference in debating income distribution when people believe that the ratio between the top and the bottom is 16.7 to 1, and when it's 4 to 1.
Now, this is just income, right, on an
This is
annual
just
basis. What about the charge on the left that wealth inequality has expanded enormously over the years because of the rise in money that people make from capital gains, which are taxed at a preferential rate?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that people accumulate at different rates. We don't have good data on wealth. And all of the analysis you see is on using numbers that are basically constructed. But there's also another problem, and that is for a lower middle income household, how much is their commitment they have on Social Security worth? How much is the commitment on Medicaid worth? So trying to construct this is very difficult. And you can, by not counting public aspects of the wealth of people who have federal guarantees,
Right.
You can distort the figure however you want to. And as I pointed out in an article in the journal, and it's in the book, that when ProPublica used the stolen tax data, they used the income data, but they didn't use the tax data because it didn't make their case. They made their case by making up an income figure that included asset appreciation.
Right, which is not tax.
Which is not income.
Yeah.
So you don't pay taxes on the appreciation of your house or your retirement plan or nothing until you sell it and realize an income where you have income to pay the taxes. And we look at the Piketty studies, and we're able to show that they get the results they get because they don't count any government transfer payments.
This is Thomas Piketty, French economist.
Yes, and also they make up an income figure based on their estimate of asset appreciation, which is not income, and that when you adjust for those things, you get the same results we get.
Now, you also argue that the statistical problem distorts the child poverty rate, which, of course, is something that resonates politically when people talk about child poverty. Nobody wants any child to live in poverty. What's the magnitude of that distortion?
Well, it's dramatic. Let me just give you the history real quickly. The poverty rate in general and for children fell dramatically from 1947 to 1965. And then in 1965, it basically remained unchanged for 50 years as the poverty rate oscillated between about 16% and about 14%.
This is the official poverty rate.
That's right, the official poverty number, even though government transfer payments to the bottom quintile, bottom 20% of income earners grew from $9,800 to $45,400.
On average a year.
Yeah, so how can you give an average family $45,400 and yet the poverty rate's unaffected? Well, the answer is because you don't count it. And Biden and the Speaker and the Majority Leader all promised that their tax credit was going to cut the child poverty rate in half. Well, it didn't. And so the census put out an experimental measure that counted the tax credit as sort of a cover-yourself effort. But the official number, which we will debate for years to come, was unchanged. So what is happening is, this is hard to believe, but believe me, it's happening, is that we spend all this money, the census doesn't count it. There's a problem that the census shows in its data. We spend more money, census doesn't count it. And the tragedy is not only are we running up the deficit and the debt, but the money is not reaching the roughly 2% or so of people that are really poor. The money's going to people that have long since not been poor. But you've got about 2% of the people, children and families, that fall through the cracks because of severe mental illness, because of drug addiction, that never apply for the programs. They're the people you see on the streets here, there, and everywhere, and many you don't see. And we're just not reaching those people, and spending more money on the current programs doesn't reach them.
So let me ask you, why you think we haven't adjusted the official figures over the years for these facts? I mean, this is not, with all due respect, we have known for a while, quite a number of years, that the poverty figures are not including most transfer payments. Why hasn't this been changed?
Well, that gets into a political question, which I tried to avoid in the book. You ask yourself, in 1947, what the census did made sense. We had limited ability to collect statistics. Very few people got fringe benefits in 1947. Poverty programs were almost totally in cash or cash equivalent, and it was a good approximation. The question is, over the years, as new benefits were added and the census decided, why didn't it count them?
Mm-hmm.
It's a question that obviously is very difficult to answer. A political scientist ought to go back and look at it. But it is pretty clear that the decisions leaned heavily in one direction, and that is undercount transfers, overcount inequality and poverty. And, of course, those numbers end up being the focal point of the debate.
Sure, because we keep seeing that poverty is 13, 14%. And people say, oh, well, let's do something about it. And it turns out it's not 13 or 14%.